Welcome to the first License to Queer Halloween special. Yeah, let's call it that, shall we? I'm delighted to be joined by Callum McKelvie, who has written a brilliant piece on the License to Queer website about horror in Bond. Hello, Callum.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So the article that has actually been live on the website for some months, and I know we've talked via Zoom before, but we've never talked about your article in a great deal of depth. I know many people have already read your article. So this is kind of an opportunity to introduce this to the podcast audience, but also kind of add any further thoughts and feelings about horror in Bond. And a lot of people don't associate horror with Bond, and maybe by the end of this episode, we may have changed their minds. You certainly changed my mind when I read your article for the first time. Before we get stuck into it, though, those who are watching the YouTube version of this and not listening to the podcast will have already noticed that I have a sort of appropriate backdrop for a Halloween special. I've kind of got Solitaire's headpiece going on behind me. And can I just say in advance, disclaimer, voodoo is actually a recognized religion in many parts of the world, as I found out when I was doing my research for Live and Let Die. So I mean absolutely no disrespect to that, but in the way that it's represented in the Bond films, it's represented as something quite other, and Live and Let Die is the only Bond story where there are actually supernatural elements, where the possibilities of the supernatural are not shut down. So when we talk about voodoo in Bond, it's a complete misrepresentation of real life voodoo. As for that matter is tarot. So, and again, I really mean no disrespect here, because the tarot deck, and I've actually got in my hand the tarot deck. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lovers cards out of the deck just to save anyone any embarrassment, because we're about to do a little bit of a kind of a bit of a tarot reading. So I'm going to take those ones out of the deck there. So this is the deck from Live and Let Die, not the actual prop, although apparently it's been scanned from that. But this was the replica set reproduced fairly recently. So I've got a kind of a mini tarot deck. I think there are, I'm just checking here, there are 27 paintings here. Actually, there are 78, as I found in my research. There are 78 cards in a normal tarot deck. So this is only a fraction of a normal tarot deck. But we're going to use this to kick off the Halloween special to give. I suppose I get to be Solitaire here, which is the role I've always wanted to play, or Bond, depending on anyone's point of view out there. And can I just say as well, if you are watching this on YouTube, you may have noticed that Callum has gone the extra mile in terms of dressing up today. So before we get stuck into a bit of a tarot reading, what that is an amazing shirt.
It is an eBay special.
It's an eBay special.
Yeah, I'll apologise now. I've got a cold, so I'm doing my best. But if I do sniffle or cough,
well, we're going to use the tarot deck to kind of prognosticate about your cold, because apparently, when people who know tarot, and again I mean no disrespect, because some people really know their tarot and I don't. I've got another window open ready to help me with this reading, because I know next to nothing about this. So this is very much the Bond misrepresentation of tarot, I feel this is going to turn into. But apparently one of the things that you shouldn't do with tarot is, just like they do in Bond, just kind of ask a very general question like, will I be successful? Will I, die by being eaten by crocodiles? Will I whatever? So it's kind of, that's apparently not very helpful. So what we're going to do is we're going to find out how your cold's going to turn out. As I say, I've taken, to save any of our blushes, I've taken, and our partner's blushes, I've taken the lovers out of the pack.
I mean, my first question was going to be, is the deck stacked in your favor?
It is definitely not stacked in my favor. In fact, just for your benefit, I've got no skin in this game. It's your cold, Callum. It's not my cold. I've so far, although I do have a bit of a tickle in my throat today, so perhaps I haven't quite escaped the colds that seem to be omnipresent this week. And I'm terrible at dealing cards, absolutely terrible. I need croupier training, so people who know what they're doing are watching this absolutely horrified. But let's kind of see how you're. So what we're going to do. This is not going to work very well, I can already tell. is I'm going to flip the cards and you're going to say stop, and the card is going to tell us how your cold is going to turn out. So ready, and here we go.
Stop.
Okay, so I think that was the one that was kind of stuck up. So we have the tower.
Okay.
No, that doesn't look very healthy to me.
No, I have no idea what that means either.
No, I mean, that one does appear in the film, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah.
So if I just look up, and bear with me, this is the most exciting video ever.
I'm on the edge of my seat. This is, I'm enjoying this. This is intense.
And this is even an even less exciting podcast experience. So if you are listening on the podcast version, you've missed Callum's amazing shirt, his Ouija board, my solitaire backdrop, and also a screen accurate replica of the tower card from Live and Let Die. I'm sure you'll survive. But let's see how Callum's cold is going to turn out. So, right, it was upright because I didn't think to even turn it upside down. So that might be good, or maybe not. No, actually, I think that might work out badly here, Callum. So apparently it's disaster, destruction, upheaval, trauma, sudden change, and chaos. It's not sounding good, Callum.
Yeah, I mean...
And then if it was upside down, it would be the opposite: averting disaster, delaying the inevitable, resisting change. So the tower card depicts a high spire nestled on top of a mountain. Absolutely. A lightning bolt strikes the tower, setting it ablaze. Oh dear, it's just not looking good, if I'm brutally honest here. But apparently you can see it positively.
Okay.
In the sense of you being able to, I'm quoting here from the website Labyrinthos, which I have used for some research in the past, actually. Be positive. It's time for you to replace the old foundations of the past with something that's more genuine and will serve you better in what is to come. Okay, so it could mean a bit like, apparently the death card doesn't mean death in tarot. It means change. So I think we can kind of interpret the tower in a similar way.
Okay.
Should we kind of go with that? So is your cold about to go away?
Hopefully. I mean, I don't know. You were saying of getting rid of the foundations of the past, and I'm using kind of a classic McKelvie hot toddy recipe here. And I'm like, is it just telling me to take paracetamol? Is that the message here, to get rid of the hot toddy?
So have you got some medicinal booze on the go?
Yeah, let's use that term, medicinal booze.
Medicinal booze. There we go. Well, I hope all your ailments shall be swiftly cured, and you start feeling better soon, either way, whatever the tarot cards say.
I do want to say that I did think for a second when I joined, I did honestly think that you built a solitaire headdress for one tiny second, and I kind of you had. I think
I'm just trying to angle it correctly, so we'll say hello to Jane Seymour while we're here. But the lovely Jane Seymour. There we go. No, I haven't gone to that extreme yet. There's still time. Maybe next year's Halloween special.
Halloween costume. There you go. It's all.
There you go. There you go. It's I've got the Octopussy robe. As soon as 007 store starts stocking the solitaire headdress, I'm all over that. Anyway, should we talk Bond and horror? So when you first sent me the article, as I say, I'd kind of had a few thoughts about Bond and horror, especially when I was researching Live and Let Die. But your article opened my mind to thinking about it in lots of different ways, and some of the other examples, which perhaps didn't spring as readily to mind, definitely struck a chord with me. And if you say Bond and horror to a lot of Bond fans, they probably do think of particular scenes. Maybe not the one that you started your article with, though. So you started your article with Goldfinger and the Golden Cadaver. So why did you start your article with that one?
Yeah, so basically, it's not a scene that I have any kind of, it didn't used to scare me as a kid or anything like that, but I took my partner to see Goldfinger at the Prince Charles screenings at the start of the year. And he is now, but he wasn't at the time really a Bond fan. But he managed to see a couple as a kid, as I think you do if you grow up in the UK. They're always on TV. And he'd watched that with his grandma. And he had been really frightened by that sequence because in his mind, I think he told me he was about like 6 or 7 maybe. She'd physically been turned into gold. And that was this really kind of terrifying moment for him. I don't even think he got to seeing Goldfinger. As in the character. I think he kind of wandered in on that scene. And that was the only bit he saw. But he was really scared of Goldfinger as a person because he thought, oh, well, this person could turn people to gold. He was actually quite disappointed when we watched it because he didn't realize it was just pink.
Wow.
When it happens in the plot, he was a little bit disappointed. But to him, it was one of those kind of sort of slightly deeply buried kind of childhood fears. I think we all have, we all have stuff that scared us as a kid. I'm sure a lot of us have things from Bond films.
Yeah, we're going to get into that, childhood associations with things. So that's fascinating because his mind had sort of filled in a kind of blank, which in the film it's mentioned she's been painted with gold paint. But if you're watching that when you're a little kid, you might not catch that. And so his mind had sort of thought there's a transformation going on here, which I know we're going to come to as well when we talk about queerness and horror. Yeah, so we'll kind of talk about that in a minute. But some of the other examples, so people listening might have already thought of Moonraker and the scene where Corinne Dufour is torn apart by dogs, which I, even as a grown adult, I find really difficult to watch, actually. Is that something that's the same for you?
I mean, it's actually one of my favorite scenes.
Probably. See, that's where you and I differ, Callum.
Yeah, I don't know
that's
where
you and I differ.
I mean, I enjoy it because there is this, I think particularly when you watch it on rewatches, you know what's going to happen. You know that Bond isn't coming to the rescue. And for me, it's kind of an added element that I think sets the franchise apart from other franchises. And I'm sure we'll get to this again. It's the danger factor, which is a big thing in horror. That there is at least one scene in one film where Bond doesn't save her and Corinne dies a really horrible death. And I enjoy that aspect because it gives the films a bit of a kind of extra added level of danger. But I can see that if you're a young kid, and particularly the way I wrote it in the article was that that was a friend's story, and their mum was reassuring them the whole time. Don't worry, Bond's going to swing in any second now. Bond doesn't, and that was his kind of traumatizing Bond moment. But that's one that I think scares quite a lot of people. I've heard a lot of different fans say that's kind of a big moment for them.
I love the way in your article you talk not only about the things that scared you, but you did collect it from your partner and friends. And so is this a topic of conversation that has come up a few times?
Yeah, I mean, for me, if I'm honest, it's always been a part of Bond. I was quite surprised when the article went live that it wasn't something that a lot of people considered, because the macabre in James Bond and the frightening moments, that was always something that, with my family and with my friends, that had just come up, moments that we were talking about the movies and I go, oh, that's the one where the guy gets eaten by a shark. I hated that. And that was always kind of just an element of Bond, was that it had this kind of darker sensibility to it. So I was quite surprised, really.
And being as you brought up sharks, was it you or was it someone else who had was it a nightmare, or you kind of had difficulty getting to sleep because of that scene in License to Kill?
It was me, and it wasn't a nightmare. I was utterly convinced that sharks were swimming around the bed. I don't really know what I was doing. No. I mean, yeah, it's funny now. I'm traumatized. The sharks swimming around. I don't know what I was doing watching License to Kill, really. My parents are quite funny about what films they let me watch, but I'm guessing because it was James Bond, they thought it was okay. But I think I probably got to the end of that sequence, Felix Leiter's sequence, and that was it. I didn't sleep. I was utterly convinced there were sharks swimming around the bed. And the space capsule in You Only Live Twice, that was me. That was one that really frightened me. And I still can't really explain that one. That's probably the strangest, I think.
I think it's the whole loneliness of space and suffocation and power. I mean, maybe in both of those, it's the utter powerlessness. They are kind of bound, aren't they? They're tied, and we're going to get into some of the sort of tying people up elements of Bond, particularly in relation to the novels, in just a bit. So let's kind of back up a little bit and think, why, as queer people, as you and I oh, why do we, and you're obviously drawn to horror more than I am. I've got a relatively decent grounding in kind of the canon, if you want to use that term, of classic horror movies. You've got a far broader awareness though. And there have been points in my life. I'm actually getting a bit more squeamish as I get older, I think. But particularly in my late teens and 20s, I loved horror movies. And perhaps not, now I'm thinking about it actually on the spot, maybe that's prior to coming out as well. So there was something there that I was kind of drawn to things that were a bit more, should we say, transgressive? Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is just my opinion, and there's a lot of excellent material already written on why queer people are attracted to horror films and queer readings of horror films. One of the most famous is Monsters in the Closet by Harry M. Bentoff, which is a really famous kind of queer reading of horror film text. But to me, it's always been the transgressive element. That's always part of it. I think that there is this, it's what I mentioned before about there being the danger factor. In the same way that I think a lot of cult films have become kind of queer classics. I think this element of horror was an outsider genre, and still is really. It didn't win Oscars.
No.
It was made by people, a lot of it was independent. It was made by people outside the industry, and they were making films that weren't your stereotypical movies. They were strange, they were weird. I think the other element is that if sci-fi is holding a mirror up to the world and the fears of the world and kind of using that as a metaphor, then I think that horror is holding up a mirror to ourselves and looking at our anxieties and our collective fears, or individual fears in a lot of cases. And it's far more psychological. And I think it is quite cathartic, and I'm certainly not the first to say this. You go and see a horror film and either feel scared or see a character on screen that maybe reflects parts of yourself which you're frightened by or make you uncomfortable. And it does it in a very kind of heavy metaphorical way. And I think maybe those two reasons. I think the transgressive element, but also the fact that, as queer persons, we do have kind of fears and anxieties, and sometimes seeing these very heavy metaphorical kind of stories, we can relate in a certain way.
And were you drawn to scary stuff as a child? I know in your article you did mention things that a lot of British people who brought up on Doctor Who, for instance. So was that where your tastes lay even when you were quite small?
Yeah, I mean, I always liked really kind of scary stuff, weird stuff. I mean, I was obsessed with Scooby-Doo. I think I mentioned in the article my mum used to play Dance Macabre and tell me stories about skeletons and things. I loved Halloween. It was my favorite time of year. I was obsessed with it. I even liked kind of black and white horror movies. As quite a small kid, actually, I think like eight years old, I was watching kind of the old Universal stuff.
Wow.
And then Doctor Who, that branched me a bit off into sci-fi, but I did always like the scary ones, and that was again something I mentioned before, something that James Bond has. It was the danger factor. There was an episode, a Tom Baker one that I had on VHS called Pyramids of Mars, and there's a cliffhanger in that where a sort of mysterious alien figure steps out of a sarcophagus and kind of chokeholds a guy, and all this smoke comes off this man and he's screaming, and that was traumatizing. I was really frightened by that, but I still watched the rest. I still went back, and I think that was sort of a big part of it. So horror's always been horror, spooky stuff, skeletons, like pumpkins. I've always loved that stuff.
And then that sort of progressed to watching, well, when did you get into Hammer horror and kind of, as you put in your article, more flamboyant horror? There's a great kind of strand of camp that runs through a lot of Hammer horror films, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, weirdly, I wouldn't watch horror films. I was afraid of being afraid.
Right.
And so I didn't want to watch scary movies. And I was also kind of, when I was kind of a teenager, it was, or at least an early teenager, Saw was the big thing. And it was a lot of what has been coined kind of torture porn, which isn't really my cup of tea. I enjoy horror, but that's just not really where my tastes lie.
No, I really can't stomach the Saw. I watched the first Saw in the cinema, and the part where they had to, isn't there a part where they have to dig the key out of someone's body or something like that? And I'm just like,
I think so, yeah. I'm not sure.
I'm just like, no, I'm good. I'm not going to bother watching the rest, thanks.
I went around a friend's house and they showed me The Descent, which I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I've seen The Descent, yeah.
And that was too much. Like I was like 11, and I was not okay with that. And I kind of assumed that, I think like a lot of people, quite wrongly, I would say, they assume that that's what horror is. It is all people running around the woods with knives or Saw, or it's just violence, it's nasty. And it really isn't that. And
No.
I happened across some Hammer. I got into Hammer horror. And I was like, oh, this is like Doctor Who, but with gothic monsters. And it's really not scary. They're all PG.
Yeah.
But it's quite, as you said, it's quite camp. And I think that appealed in a way that there was this slightly old-fashioned quaintness about it. But there was also sort of an honesty. And when they're good, they're good. And I think that's the thing, is that they are really classic films, and I would champion them. And I sort of then went from there into, I started branching out. The Omen was the first one that was kind of more of like a proper horror film. And that coincided in a strange way. I was obsessed with Omen 2. I don't know if you've seen that.
I've only seen the first one. No, I haven't seen the second.
Slight spoiler.
Okay.
Damien in that film was a teenager.
Ah.
Being probably about a year younger than me or older, I can't remember which way. And he does not want to be the Antichrist. And that's the whole kind of conceit of that film. And I am adamant that because I was obsessed with that movie and that element, not the death scenes, not any of the kind of devil stuff, the fact that he did not want to be the Antichrist. I'm convinced that that probably fed into my own feelings, because I knew that I was queer at the time.
Yeah.
So to me, Damien Omen 2, unsung queer masterpiece. I relate to the Antichrist. You heard it first here, live on air.
So almost like not wanting. I had that a bit with Star Wars, which obviously isn't a horror film, but it's that kind of idea of going to the dark side almost, and you kind of seeing queerness as, is that sort of why you related to that character, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I did not want to be gay at the time.
Yeah.
I had some opinions which were very wrong. And as I got older, I've learned that, and I've embraced my sexuality, and I've been embraced, by my queer friends and my partner, and that's lovely. But at the time, it was something that I was afraid of. I thought the world was going to hate me, and so here's this movie where someone who's kind of my age, who was a bit preppy, and I think I was a bit of a preppy kid. And he's found out he's the biggest baddie of all, and he doesn't want it, but he accepts it. And obviously him accepting it is a bad thing. But there was sort of an element of that, the way he kind of takes ownership of that towards the end of the film. I did relate to. I've not seen many queer readings of it, but it is one that I really did.
I have never ever, and I've read, quite a few books about queer cinema over the years, obviously, but I've never ever seen that one come up in conversation. And I'm now determined to see this film in the next few weeks, because it sounds exactly like my cup of tea. And I'd just like to say thank you for sharing that, actually, because a lot of people actually don't feel comfortable about talking about that. It's something I have written about, but a lot of, I don't know a single queer person who, when they realized they were queer, would ever kind of say, yes, I've fully embraced this and it's brilliant about me. I'm sure there are people, but I've just never met them. I've often used the analogy when I've done presentations and things in my kind of day job in education, and and other things of like, if I'd had a switch where I could have gone from, you know, and I could have pressed it and I'd turn straight, I would have pressed that switch in an absolute heartbeat for about 20 years of my life if that switch had been there. Obviously now there's no way I would ever want to press that switch, and I'm so glad that that was never, you know, obviously never an option. But if we were living in some kind of weird sci-fi realm where, you know, that's possibly the reason why some people voluntarily, I don't know, go to conversion therapy or whatever. They're kind of determined to do whatever it takes to flip that switch, and I've never been that way. I did feel that way, that I wanted to press that switch, but you know, since coming out 14 years ago, I've never ever felt that way. But it's interesting watching those films that I was watching at that time, and I think, oh, maybe this is why I can relate to Luke Skywalker, because he is trying not to turn to the dark side, but it would only take a little bit of a nudge. And all these characters, you know, in film, I love, it's sort of got horror elements, but I love the film Talented Mr. Ripley. Even though that film is about, in many ways, a deeply unlikable character, I can relate to him having to repress his really kind of horrible side and all those sorts of things. And in your article, you mentioned, and I remember watching this when I was closeted and loving it, even though I knew a lot of other people derided it. But you mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street 2 in your article.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of those films that kind of has become sort of a kind of iconic queer film.
Yeah.
And there are elements, as you say, sort of interesting. It's been a long time since I've seen it, I will be honest. But it is one of those movies that I think when you go towards kind of queer horror films, that quite often comes up. You know, I think what you were saying just now about how you felt when you were younger. So, you know, I think it's important that we say that, yeah, when I came out, I didn't, you know, I wouldn't change it for the world now.
No.
But it obviously wasn't something I wanted then. And interestingly, there was a night at a party when I was quite close to coming out. I had a bit too much to drink, and I got a bit upset. And the word I kept referring to, the word I kept using, is I kept calling myself a monster. And I think that sort of relates to some of this stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
And Elm Street 2 is quite a good one in that there are those elements, and it is problematic, I think, if you try and look at it a bit too deep.
Oh yeah.
There was a long time when it wasn't. Basically, everybody, I believe, everybody involved in the film, no one would admit that it was intentionally homoerotic. And then in the documentary Never Sleep Again, I think the writer.
It's a really good documentary. If people haven't seen it, there's a whole feature-length documentary about Nightmare on Elm Street 2, and the homophobia angle is a massive part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a film that I kind of view as sort of more. I mean, if I'm going to watch Elm Street 2, it's with a couple of beers, and I'm going to kind of laugh at it. I enjoy it as a kind of, I think I called it a homoerotic romp. And that's sort of, you know, that it's not one that I think I don't go in there looking for a reflection of myself.
No, perhaps not.
Yeah, it's a film I laugh at, but you know, I think it was probably quite brave, in quotation marks, quite brave for the time, for a major horror sequel to suddenly be incredibly gay.
Yeah. And
it didn't work. It was a bad film, not because it had gay elements, but unfortunately, you know, they then kind of did a reset with Elm Street 3. But it's strange that we have this major horror sequel that is now kind of lauded as a sort of camp queer classic.
We're very good at kind of reclaiming films, I think, people that might have been misunderstood. I always want to champion those sorts of films. See Diamonds Are Forever. But it's interesting. You just talked about thinking of yourself and even vocalizing a sentiment that you felt like a monster. And as soon as you said that, I thought about James Whale, which I know both of us have a passion for James Whale films. I actually wrote an article about James Whale because funny enough, I drove past it on tonight as we were going somewhere, the place where he was actually born. and he's literally like 10 minutes from my house.
Wow.
So here in the West Midlands, but he went off to Hollywood after growing up in Dudley in the West Midlands, and basically created the modern, well, or basically created the monster movies, didn't he, with Universal?
I think that there's also as well, I'm not an expert on this, but I think there's an argument that he also created camp.
Right.
If he's not the sort of center of it, that he certainly introduced it to horror. His film, the old Dark House.
Yes, I love that film.
Is so camp.
Oh yeah.
But you know what you're saying about him and the fact that I call myself a monster. There's a lot of readings that, particularly in the two Frankenstein films he directed, Frankenstein from 1931 and Bride of Frankenstein from 35, 36. That there is an element that the Frankenstein monster is really a metaphor for Whale as a gay man. I'm not sure how much I believe that personally. I think the film Gods and Monsters with Ian McKellen,
great film.
I think that kind of ran with that bit more.
Yeah.
But I mean, Bride is especially a movie that I think does. There are a lot of discussions of kind of queer pain in there, and the way that the queer world views itself. Again, so I'm sounding very grandiose. These are just my personal readings, obviously. But I mean, it's a fascinating film in many ways. I mean, the villain, Dr. Pretorius, is so camp and incredibly coded.
Who, the same actor, he appears in Old Dark House, doesn't he? So if anyone's never seen any James Whale movies, I'd probably recommend, I think Old Dark House would be a good one to start with. It's sort of the archetype of, you know, this the kind of not even haunted house, but a house where, you know, you turn up in the middle of the night, a bit like Rocky Horror Picture Show takes off. You turn up in the middle of the night in a horrendous storm, and then everything's not quite as it seems in the house. So yeah, there's a monster living in the attic, without giving away too many spoilers. And the monster could be read as queer longing, queer pain, just as all that, and played by Boris Karloff, who then played Frankenstein's monster, who can be read in that way, particularly in Bride of Frankenstein. What you're saying about camp, I've never heard that before, actually, until you just said it, that James Whale could be considered the father or a father of camp, because those films could be taken seriously, maybe. I don't know. There are parts where you think, how could anyone kind of just see this as a horror movie? But that's kind of the genius of pure camp. It presents itself seriously, but if you're in the know, it's real. I remember reading a review actually by Graham Greene, a writer I love, but Graham Greene wrote a review of The Bride of Frankenstein because he was a film reviewer in the 30s and 40s.
I didn't know.
He slated the film, saying, how could anyone possibly be scared of this? Which kind of says to me, Graham Greene, ostensibly a straight guy, didn't get it. You know, this film is not supposed to be scary. And I think, in fact, I think if I remember correctly, in Gods and Monsters, which is one of my favorite films, Ian McKellen playing James Whale, a slightly fictionalized version of James Whale, says, why would I make a serious film about death? I'm paraphrasing here, but a comedy about death. And that's essentially what Bride of Frankenstein is. So we could turn this into a whole James Whale podcast, I feel. maybe for another time, but I love Jack. And, you know, but the point is, all of those classic Universal monster movies, which I think are going to get, I know the new cinematic universe around Universal Monsters has died a death. But in the theme parks, they're going to have certainly in Florida, they're going to have a whole area now for the Universal monsters. And Frankenstein, Invisible Man is another great James Whale one. But most of those movies, even as a kid, when I was watching them, and even as an adult, I always related to the monster because the main characters are so like insipid, and the romance plots are so like tacked on. And completely, you just don't buy it. And the happy ending when the monster is killed or defeated and the straight couple live happily ever after, I just never bought that. And I don't think anyone is expected to buy it. So I think they leave you with the sensation that we're basically on the side of the monster Is that something you kind of take away from it as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting as well that obviously the whale films have a kind of queerness to them. But Dracula's Daughter, from I think the same year as Bride Frankenstein, 35, 36, that's held up as a kind of queer sort of film. And I think there is this element of, you know, you do relate to the monsters.
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well that I think with a lot of 1930s and 1940s horror, whether they were made by queer filmmakers or not, there is a strong relatability element, I think, for queer people.
Yeah.
And for anybody who feels like an outsider, I think that's the end of it. There's a fantastic series of 1940s horror films by a guy called Val Lewton, who was a producer. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
I would highly recommend his stuff. For anybody listening, 3 of them are on iPlayer if you're in the UK.
Wow.
Cat People, I Walk with a Zombie, and
it's Cat People on iPlayer.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to see that.
Yeah, no, okay, it's on there, and I think it's on there for like the foreseeable, at least.
Wow.
But the 1942 one that's a film that, you know, I think has been queer read quite a lot, because it's about a young woman, a Serbian refugee who comes to New York, and she falls in love with a young American guy, but the problem is that she can't consummate their marriage because she feels like if she does, she will turn into a cat because of her heritage and folklore. It's a really intelligent film, and one which, again, I think kind of queer persons are related to. I've certainly related to that. Again, when I was younger, that was one that I was sort of like, oh, you know, just coming out and feeling sexual pressure. I didn't think I'd turn into a cat, but there was that kind of element of sort of, oh, I'm kind of getting this. So I think, you know, relating to the monsters, and the monsters are quite often sympathetic in horror, particularly in classic horror. You know, I think how did you describe them? Tepid straight couples as the what did you say?
Insipid.
Insipid, sorry.
I'm just like, what? I mean, Mary Shelley obviously wrote the novel of Frankenstein, and there is, you know, she didn't expect us to buy the or even really be interested in the road. I mean, for a start, you know, spoiler alert, but if you've never read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, please read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's incredible. You know, that book created like so many genres in itself, not just horror but sci-fi and loads of stuff. But the romance plot doesn't end happily, let's just put it that way. Nothing ends happily in that, and I would argue that we're still, even though the monster does actually horrible things, we're still inclined to feel more sympathy for the monster than we are for Dr. Frankenstein himself. So yeah, I would recommend everyone reads that one. Really, something you said earlier about violence has kind of stuck in my head as well, because a lot of people do think horror, horrible violence, and we've talked a lot about the psychology side of things. And Bond does sometimes go there in terms of violence. It's often suggested. So one of the examples you brought up in your article was the KGB agent being thrown into the what would you call it, macerator, propeller, whatever it is, by in Zorin's facility, and that did scar me as a child. That one did. Was that one for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, View to a Kill in general, I did one of the reviews for the really 007 podcast, and I called it out as being quite a nasty film.
Yeah,
I think it is an example of a very transgressive Bond film.
Yes,
and certainly the sequence with the KGB agent as a kid, I actually had for a long time. It took me a while to trace it back. I had a fear of machinery. I don't mean hair dryers and toasters, but I had a fear of being caught in a machine, which sounds, you know, yeah, that sounds very kind of Rage Against the Machine. That's my left side coming out. But I did have this fear of, I used to have nightmares about machinery, and it took me a while to kind of trace it back to that film. It was only when I watched it, I think when I was 16, 17 again, I was like, oh no, it's this. like this is the bit.
Wow.
I didn't know it was this movie, but this is, and it is an example of, I think, it's not a necessary scene. If you're going to be slightly awkward about it, there is no need for that to happen. But again, it's that danger factor. And I think View to a Kill already has the transgressive element of danger factor down. The mine massacre is horrendous, you know, and there's people trying to climb out and getting electrocuted. There's sparks flying, there's people being gunned down. It's just, it really is a sequence that probably, I think some people would say, oh, that shouldn't be in a Bond film. But that's kind of what I like about it. It's why View to a Kill is one of my favorites, because there is this undercurrent of what's going to happen. And even Roger Moore seems a bit uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
I'm not, this isn't Bond, like this isn't what I do. And I enjoy that element about the film. It's one of the ones which I would say, I don't think structurally it resembles a horror film, but it has that transgressive thing there.
I would agree. I mean, Roger Moore actually did say, I think, in several interviews that he didn't like the massacring of the soldiers at the miners at the end. It didn't feel like a Bond film to him. But for me, I love View to a Kill because it does have that real mix of tones, which I think is kind of like a camp thing as well. You have like really horrible violence scenes that are pretty tasteless in some ways, alongside quite tender stuff, and some people can't deal when films vacillate between different tones. Personally, I've always loved that sort of thing. So but as a child, I was absolutely horrified by that particular moment. And perhaps actually, as you were saying, I was just like, I did have a recurring nightmare about being eaten by an escalator, partly because I dropped a tube of Smarties down one when I was a kid and watched them being munched up by the escalator. So maybe that was tied in with View to a Kill.
Let's blame View to a Kill.
That's it. So View to a Kill,
trauma.
We're calling it now. You know, we weren't going to do this. We hadn't planned to do this, but if we were to pin down the scariest Bond film, I think we're saying it's A View to a Kill.
I'll go with that. I'll second that.
Although you did name several other possible moments in your article that are kind of horrible. I mean, the great thing is with View to a Kill, that moment where the agent gets killed, you don't see any gore or anything. You do see his body kind of going towards, so it's more than suggestive. But then it cuts away to the pressure indicator going down and going haywire, which is even worse than if we'd seen the gore. I think it's our mind fills in those blanks again, a bit like your partner with the golden cadaver. But you also, in your article, you mentioned the car crush in Goldfinger, the ice shredder in On Her Majesty's. He had a lot of guts. Stromberg's assistant being eaten by the shark, and you see her arm later on in the tank. And one that I imagine a lot of people have perhaps been thinking of, and if they haven't, they're probably going to kick themselves at this point. But Milton Crest's head exploding in License to Kill. So is the View to a Kill moment worse than any of those moments, you think?
I mean, it's interesting what you said about kind of filling in the blanks, because that is there's a big school of horror that basically says, oh, what you don't show is scarier. And that's the constant argument I think that the horror genre is having with itself. You've got the Saws on the one hand, but then you have films which are far more psychological. They try and mess with you a bit. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think everybody expects to see a lot of chainsaws and some massacring. You see a lot of the former, but there's very little blood.
Yeah.
And I think it shocks a lot of people upon first viewing. They think they see more than they do. And so I wonder if, maybe that's it with View to a Kill, because the Milton Crest scene is horrific. But I would argue that it's horrible for, I mean, how long does it last? Like, what, 30 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, that whole sequence is probably about 30 seconds, yeah.
I think it's worse when he's just in there screaming and it's the actor physically reacting to the pain of the increasing pressure than the 2 seconds of the balloon. That's the payoff, but I think the reason why the View to a Kill scene, I would probably argue, I didn't come on thinking I was going to argue that this was the scary scene in a Bond film, but I'm here, I'll do it. I think that's scary because you don't have that payoff. As you said, you just have the pressure gauge. You don't see anything. You're left wondering. Whereas the Milton Crest thing, it is a really powerful scene and it is horrible, but it's not an effect that's held up.
I actually think the ITV film version is probably scarier because they always cut the balloon bit, or at least most of the time they do when they show it during the day anyway. And I think because certainly I know I'm quite a bit younger than you, but I watched all of the Bond films the first time on TV with ad breaks and with the really violent bits cut out. I think some of these scenes, I've thought they were actually worse than they were because my mind is, it's really interesting what you say. There is that school of thought. I've always thought horror is scarier when you don't see the blood and gore. I mean, the most horrifying bit, and for me, going back to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is when you see the hook in the foreground of the shot in the kitchen area or whatever it is, and then you know what's going to happen, and even if you don't watch what happens next, is seeing that hook and the suggestion of it, which is incredibly powerful. So I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot claim credit for that. That's an argument that's been going on really for I think decades. I mentioned Val Lewton before. He was one of the big purveyors in terms of, oh, I'm going to try not to show the monster. I'm going to have, the story goes they gave him a title. It was Cat People, and everyone expected him to make a Wolfman ripoff with Cat People, and he makes a movie where you don't see a cat person. It's all shadows. It's all suggestion, and that's 10 times more terrifying. I think with a lot of kind of the classic movies, Halloween as well.
Yeah.
The original, the violence is non-existent compared to, I'm a big defender of the most recent Halloween film, Halloween Kills, but the gore in that is extreme.
Oh, right. I still haven't seen that one. I saw the first one of those kind of reboots, but not the latest one.
I really enjoy it. I mean, I am in a very small pond, and I tend to be like that with a lot of my horror taste. So I do tend to go for the undefended films, but it is just an example of them kind of upping the violence. And I wonder if that's something with the Bond films, in that when, particularly I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to watch incredibly violent films. I didn't have a strict upbringing, but I wasn't exposed to horror cinema, and particularly when I was kind of getting into the Bond films, like age 5. No one gets crushed in a car crusher in Scooby-Doo.
No.
So that was sort of like, what is this? Like, there was a man in that car, and now that car is a box, and the man is still in it. And I think my parents kind of, I'm trying not to make them sound bad now, but I think they slightly delighted in sort of telling me the macabre stuff. They were like, oh yeah, they crushed him. I was like, oh, that's horrible. Like, so I quite, I think the Bond films are very good at sort of sticking in those very macabre, slightly nasty moments, but not going there, not kind of going all out gore. I think when they do, it's refreshing. And I don't want to hate on the Milton Crest scene, because I actually really like that moment, because it is so surprising, so sort of just out of left field. And I wouldn't mind a slightly gorier Bond film. But I do think that the classic ones are the reason why they're scary. I mean, it's Korean as well. Like, the camera pans up when the dogs pounce. You don't see. You're left imagining. And and I believe John Barry plays there's a church bell, isn't there?
Yeah.
Over there. So
which actually is a brilliant edit, because it takes us into St. Mark's Square in Venice, which is obviously a really romantic setting. But it's a really kind of horrible juxtaposition at the same time. I know that when it comes to the books, the novelist Kim Sherwood, who's written Double or Nothing recently, she says one of the Fleming traits that she tried to and very successfully sort of took on when she was writing her Bond novel, was trying to create uncanny imagery, things that would kind of unsettle the reader. And she uses Fleming's analogy of fingers moving across a table like crab claws.
Hmm.
And there are all those little bits that are quite creepy and stick in your memory from Fleming's novels. In your article, you wrote about some of the more extreme, uncomfortable moments in Fleming's books. So everyone perhaps might be thinking now of the carpet beater torture in Casino Royale, but I know that you're a big fan of the novel of Dr. No as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. No, it's interesting what you said about Kim Sherwood and uncanny imagery, because the first quote I had to mind, and I'm going to butcher it, is the description of Dr. No as being like what is it, a venomous worm in it's a tinfoil or something like that. You know, it's
Wow.
something along those lines, isn't it? I've I say I
I
remember
need to
the
look
quote,
it up myself. Yeah.
but it's that very striking description of him, and I think Dr. No is a really good example of horror elements, in that there is a large amount of the bizarre. I have a bit of a thing for the dragon tank in both book and film. Dragon tank is my queen.
Haven't you actually got a dragon tank?
It's there.
Is it there on the? Oh, there it is.
Far too much for that.
Podcast listeners, head over to YouTube. You can see the dragon tank on his top shelf next to the Ouija board.
Yeah, it was when I found out that the one in the steelbook was cardboard, and I was like, no, I want an actual one.
An actual dragon tank.
But that is an element in both the book and the film, when it just takes on, it goes to another level. Like, we're in a spy thriller. It's a bit strange. It's a bit pulpy, and I'm using that word not disingenuously.
No.
But then suddenly there's a dragon. And when I took my partner to see Dr. No, he'd not seen it, and he was kind of sitting there and he was like, what is this? He was like, there's a dragon. He was like, is it Komodo dragon? And I was like, just watch the film. Like, just watch it, see what happens. And then suddenly we're in this underground base, and the novel, I think, is, you know, it was the one that really caused an outrage in terms of the reviews, and I believe the whole sex snobbery and sadism. I believe that entire review was about Dr. No. And it is the one which I think is perhaps the most transgressive, along with Going With Twice. But it certainly has, there's the weird in there. It's violent. It's also incredibly sexual, which I think is very important to horror. Sex and death, which are two massive elements in Bond, are two really important elements in horror. And I think Dr. No kind of has all of those elements pinned down. And the villain, you know, he's almost a kind of horror. You know, he has metal claws, and his heart's on the wrong side of his chest. There is this kind of sort of, he's the most monstrous, I think, of the villains physically up until that point.
Yeah.
So it's my favorite of the Fleming books. Make of that what you will. Not just because of the dragon tank, though. Extra bonus points.
Bonus points for a dragon tank. And it's not my favorite book. I really like it. Obviously, I don't dislike any of the Fleming books, but it's somewhere kind of in the middle for me. But you also really like the one that is my favorite Fleming book, You Only Live Twice, which you analysed in your article as having gothic tropes. And I'm not sure, to be honest, even though I love that novel and read it however many times, I don't think I've ever really thought about it as much in terms of Gothic conventions. So, you know, even going back to the Gothic fiction, the 18th century, like Horace Walpole's novels and that sort of thing, where you've got the hero, and then later, obviously in the 19th century, you've got what's his name, Jonathan, going to Dracula's castle, and it's that sort of Gothic narrative trajectory you've got going on in that novel. So is there anything else you want to say about You Only Live Twice?
I mean, yeah, I definitely, I would stop short of calling it a Gothic novel, but certainly that was how I kind of see it. The journey to the castle, the villain living in a castle, and sort of the way that Blofeld is portrayed in that book is quite Gothic.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to go more visceral, The Poison Garden, there is the imagery in that, and the idea of him surrounding his castle with this kind of poisonous landscape. There's a lot of, again, it's the imagery of death and the kind of obsession that book has with death. I think, you know, I believe I called it in the article, perhaps the truest Fleming's come to horror. The idea I had really is that it's perhaps, you know, if Fleming is facing death at that time, which I know a lot of people who said, you know, perhaps not quite so obviously, but he was in ill health.
Yes.
And this is a novel in which Bond is confronting death, that maybe there was some catharsis for Fleming there. I mentioned earlier about how a lot of works of horror are the filmmakers dealing with kind of personal demons. And I think that sort of, you know, we all have to deal with death in some way. And I think that You Only Live Twice has that element. I believe I did also go on to say that it could be a metaphor for queer loss, in the same way that I think that you can read into a lot of different works of horror under a queer lens. But it's I definitely say, I think if Dr. No is my pulpy horror Bond, You Only Live Twice is probably the Bride of Frankenstein, let's put it that way. Without the comedy, sorry, a bit more kind of, you know, there's lots to be read in there, and I think it's a very dark, quite powerful book. What's your favorite?
Yeah, I think that's probably why I love it, because it does have a psychological power, which is not necessarily always as obvious. I think all the Bond books actually, although Fleming himself was kind of quite self-deprecating about taking his novels too seriously, I think they've all got elements of that. But particularly Only Live Twice, I think you could. It just bears endless rereadings to me, and I think the horror elements, as you say, the garden, which obviously is reproduced in some form, a kind of less gothic version, perhaps, in No Time to Die. But I'm, you know, I've tried to explain to God knows how many students over the years what gothic really is, and it's incredibly hard to pin down, a bit like camp. And I think those two have got quite a lot in common: the ostentatiousness, somewhat overblown version of reality, a kind of hyper reality. And I think all of that is very Bondian to me. I suppose the last thing to kind of talk about that you mentioned in your article, and let it be said, you know, we've not touched on anywhere near all of the examples that you've referenced in your article, but I know we could literally talk all night about this until next Halloween. But I suppose the last thing that I think it would be really good to talk about is, you wrote really eloquently about macabre humor in Bond. And I already mentioned the Sanchez gag, Launder It, after Crest gets his head blown up. You also cited as one of your favorites, if that's the right word, when Hans ends up in the piranha moat in You Only Live Twice. Bond looks a little bit snarkily down off the shot and says bon appetit. And you saw a kind of parallel with some aspects of queer culture in that, didn't you?
Yeah, it's the transgressive thing.
Yeah,
it's quite tasteless, and I'm not going to sit and call all of queer culture tasteless, but it is something that we've owned. I think I've used the John Waters film Pink Flamingos, and I believe he calls himself the Pope of Trash. That was what he was.
I still haven't watched Pink Flamingos. I'm so sorry.
No. Do you know what? I haven't. It's the one scene puts me off. But
is that the scene where someone? I'm going to choose my words carefully. Is that the scene where someone eats dog excrement?
Someone. It's
yeah, I know. I'd spoilers. But
okay. You know. Oh, sorry. All right. Okay, I've given it away now. But yeah, that's the scene where that's the reason I've not watched it. But
so we've yet to have that scene in Bond. I'm kind of grateful for that.
But it is that element of kind of tastelessness. I think that I mentioned in the article a story about my grandma would have been in her 30s during the releases of the Connery films. But we watched Diamonds Are Forever on TV, and the line when they photographed Miss Whistler's body, she did want some pictures of the canals for the children. It probably says quite a lot about 7-year-old Callum, but he found that incredibly funny.
Oh yeah.
And my gran she was quite shocked by that, and I then laughed a bit harder, even though we got very well, because it's like, oh, I'm shocking grandma, I'm going to laugh even more. And I think that's slightly, I think that kind of humor, that sort of slightly shocking, we view the Bond films now as a bastion of British culture, and they most certainly are. But I think we forget that they were quite sensational and they were quite shocking.
Yeah.
They did flaunt a couple of social taboos.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's probably what makes them kind of partly horror, because of this transgressive stuff. When they go into the macabre, they do that. But certainly, I think that's probably their biggest appeal for me. I've never understood the argument about wanting to be James Bond. That's never been something that I've personally related to. But for me, it was always kind of, oh, I'm going to show this film to a friend and they're going to expect a certain thing. And there'll be a dragon tank, or there'll be a joke that will really sort of, be like, well, that's a bit grim, but I'm laughing. That's a bit horrible. I think that was why the Austin Powers films took that joke to its kind of natural extreme and ended up ruining it, sadly. That's what the next Bond film needs, is more tastelessness, more quips. Bring the quips back hard.
I think that's a really good idea, to be honest. As you've been talking, I can't believe I've never made this connection before, but you were talking about, as a child, we kind of revel in tastelessness. And I was very much the same. I loved Roald Dahl books as a kid. And obviously Roald Dahl wrote You Only Live Twice. That line, Bon Appetit, that you singled out, is almost certainly written by him. And one of my favorite books, even as a 40-year-old, one of my favorite books is still, and I've read the great works. I've read Paradise Lost, I own many leather-bound books. But one of my favorite books of all time is George's Marvelous Medicine, just because it is so astoundingly, awfully tasteless, the way that one of the characters is treated in that book and the way everyone reacts. And it's like, I think Roald Dahl is so successful with children because he's dealing with some quite serious stuff. But even, up to, like, George's Marvelous Medicine ends with the death of one of the characters, but it's treated in such a kind of offhand fashion. And I think Bond's treatment of death is very similar to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Roald Dahl's an interesting figure to bring up, because I think a good portion of my generation was traumatized by the witches.
Yes. I've never told this to anyone, at least not in a public forum before, but I actually got so scared when we were reading The Witches as a kid. I had to, at school, I had to go and sit in a different room.
But I mean, I think that's part of the appeal of him, is that in some ways his stuff is horror for kids. And, certainly is it fair to call Charlie and the Chocolate Factory a slasher movie or a Saw film? They're oft one by one, they're okay. Yeah. But they all get, kind of their comeuppance in a slightly grim way, which is sort of a horror trope, really. And so I think, You Only Live Twice, the movie, is certainly one of the most tasteless Bond films in all, not just because of that line. I think it's a fairly kind of, it's also one of the most fantastic and transgressive, I think, certainly for the time. I would be interested to go back to 67. Just, they've just had Thunderball. Yeah, okay, there's elements of fantasy in that, and obviously Goldfinger, there's the laser and stuff, but suddenly you've got Volcano Base and you're in outer space and there's a piranha pit and all this kind of, but all in one movie. I would be quite interested to know how that appeals, because you do get a real sense in that movie that he's not sending Bond up, but he's having fun, and he's pushing it as far as he can in a similar way to his books. And a lot of people, I think, have said that if they don't get on with the film now, they loved it when they were a kid. And I wonder if that's, it's not one of my favorites now, I'll admit.
No, me either.
But when I was a kid, I loved it. It was one of the absolute, I really enjoyed that. And I do wonder if that was, perhaps due to him, and this kind of, for a child, it's so, the villain is not only a villain, he's so over the top. He's so creepy. the way Donald Pleasance plays that character and delivers those lines, it is extreme. It is one of those ones which I think it's maybe one of the most transgressive. I don't know if it's as successful as maybe View to a Kill, but it's interesting that you mention all that, because I think a lot of these books have horror elements, which make them appeal to kids. And I think that tastelessness that you mentioned before.
And we hadn't planned to talk about this actually, the Roald Dahl connections, but again, as we've been talking, I thought, Roald Dahl obviously adapted Chitty Chitty Bang Bang for the screen and introduced the child catcher, who's not there in the Fleming book, which is again a childhood scarring thing for a lot of people. And also, and I've just thought of this, literally just thought of this, I only found out recently that a short story of Roald Dahl's that I've used lots of times with students on how to craft a really good kind of horror story with a twist, Lamb to the Slaughter. I don't know if you've ever read that story.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
That was actually, the idea came from Ian Fleming. I
did know this recently.
I
did a deep dive into Tales of the Unexpected. That came. It was actually, I think, when I was looking at the article, when I first wrote the piece, because I was going to compare, and I can't remember if I did it. I was going to compare the Hildebrand rarity and Octopus in the short stories as being kind of sort of Dahlian in their kind of format and structure, which I'm not the first to say. Other people have said that, but so I did know that Fleming had suggested that. Sorry to steal your thunder there.
No, but please steal thunder away. Absolutely. And if we won't spoil anything, but if you've never read the story Lamb to the Slaughter by Roald Dahl, Google it. You can find it quite readily online in various PDF versions, things, because it is used as a masterclass in a lot of even university courses on how to construct a really good short story. So we're not going to spoil what happens, but it's a very clever story, as you say. And I've never made the connection until you just said, with two of my favorite Fleming short stories, Hildebrand Rarity and Octopussy. But now you've said that, I'm like, whoa, yes, they do have quite a lot of similarities. So there we go. We've ended up with, unexpectedly, an Ian Fleming Roald Dahl, several more items in our Ian Fleming Roald Dahl Venn diagram, as well as Bond and horror Venn diagram more generally. So thank you for your time, Callum. If perhaps there are films that we haven't mentioned that are mentioned in your article, particularly queer horror films. I know you're a real advocate for a film I still haven't watched, and I promise I will get around to watching it, called Knife and Heart. Would you like to offer any recommendations to listeners?
Definitely Knife and Heart. It's a French horror film from 2018.
Okay.
It's kind of a slasher, sort of murder mystery. It's quite explicit, I will say that, but it is a really good example of kind of what I was saying earlier about horror having a voice and talking about issues. I think it talks about a lot of issues in the gay community. Whilst also being incredibly fun. What I'll say is watch the first 5 minutes, and if you're up for it after that, then you're going to have a great time. Another sort of handful, obviously we mentioned Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Hellraiser has some queer elements.
Yeah, I only actually watched that about a year ago, and I absolutely adored it.
It is so good, and obviously the remake's out now in the US. I think we get it in April.
Oh, okay.
So I'd recommend anybody to watch that before then. I've got a list in front of me, so I'm just trying to
go for it.
Stranger by the Lake.
Oh yeah, very good.
Yeah, that's kind of a classic now, I think. Spiral from 2019.
Still haven't watched. Sorry.
Titan is a recent one. It's proven a bit controversial. I think it's kind of some kind of gay outlets and queer outlets are big advocates for it, others aren't.
Okay.
So maybe read up on that one. Before, I quite enjoyed it. And obviously you can't not mention Rocky Horror, which is like the queer horror film. And there's plenty more where that came from. I've just banged. I did sit down before this with my partner. I was like, Queer Horror, go. And I wrote a big list. But if more people come away from this watching Knife and Heart, I will be so happy.
I am going to make it my mission this Halloween, Callum, because I know you've recommended it to me several times, and it's just sat there on the pile. The problem is my husband hates horror films. I have to. I can only ever watch them on my own. He can't. He doesn't. You know, I've made him watch. You know, some of the canonical classics like Don't Look Now. He enjoys, and he actually really likes slasher movies, especially comedic ones, so the Scream series and all of that. But getting him to watch a horror film is a real uphill struggle.
I mean, it is a comedy slasher.
Yeah.
Maybe not comedy. It has funny moments. It's very,
Okay.
very dark in places, but it is a kind of slasher murder mystery.
Okay. Oh, hang on. He loves murder mysteries.
There
So
we go. It is
if
a
I
murder.
sell it as Murder She Wrote with queer horror elements, do you think he'll feel betrayed?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Maybe, God, Midsummer Murders
Mm-hmm.
set in a 70s French gay porn studio with elements of French art house and a soundtrack by M83, maybe. Go for that. That's the in a nutshell.
I think I might just have to watch that one on my own.
As long as I get a review, I'm happy.
Okay. I'll let you know how we get on. Or
More
I
people need
get
to watch
on.
that film.
Yeah.
People need to watch that film.
Yeah.